School kids in the UK have got a problem with their drugs. For the last couple of years, there's been a concern here that school kids might be taking synthetic cannabinoids at school when some of them are ordering cheap THC vapes online or through social media and ending up with these much more strong drugs. Now, researchers at the University of Bath have analysed 2,000 vapes that were confiscated from 114 different schools in England in the last academic year. They found that 13% of them contained synthetic cannabinoids. Synthetic cannabinoids are drugs that are much more dangerous than cannabis and are associated with things like hallucinations, extreme paranoia, seizures, addiction, withdrawal, things that are much more associated with harm than cannabis. The findings of this study, by the way, are unpublished so far and are not peer-reviewed yet. They wanted to get the data out there before the start of the school year so teachers could be more aware of this, but that's going to probably be published in a journal very soon. In the UK right now, synthetic cannabinoids are associated with some of the most vulnerable communities here: the homeless population, people in prison, and school kids. I thought it'd be interesting to do a bit of a deep dive into how synthetic cannabinoids came about, because they're completely man-made substances, and also how they made their way into these communities here in the UK. Synthetic cannabinoids are a potent man-made class of chemical substances known as synthetic cannabinoid receptor agonists. In recent times, the term spice has become a catch-all umbrella term for synthetic cannabinoids as a whole. According to the EU Drugs Agency, the first spice products that became popular on the drug scene in the UK in the early years of the new millennium contained a synthetic cannabinoid called 𝘍𝙧𝙪𝙜𝙪. There are hundreds of synthetic cannabinoids on the scene now, but many of the early ones were analogues of this particular one. But 𝘍𝙧𝙪𝙜 and many similar substances were originally developed and abandoned in the 1970s by the US pharmaceutical company Pfizer. They wanted to explore the cannabinoid system in the human body and look at potential therapeutic applications such as treating nausea and pain. A couple of decades later, some of these synthetic cannabinoids were successfully replicated by Professor John Huffman, a chemistry professor working at a university in South Carolina. He was also interested how cannabinoids worked in the human body. So Huffman and his team actually synthesized a series of more than 470 analogues of synthetic cannabinoids in the 1980s and 90s. JWH, which he lent his initials to, was the 18th experimental compound that they worked on. 𝘍𝙧𝙪𝙜 was made in 1995 by Huffman's team, and it went on to change the drug scene around the world forever. The research was published in 1998 in the Journal of Pharmacology and Experimental Therapeutics. A few years later, in the first few years of the new millennium, underground chemists in China started synthesizing 𝘍𝙧𝙪𝙜 in bulk and selling it as a recreational drug. This was when synthetic cannabinoids began appearing outside labs and research settings and moving into a sesh context, because by completing and publishing this research, Huffman and his team had unwittingly helped to spawn the multi-billion-dollar synthetic cannabinoid industry that we see today. His early compounds became a blueprint, the early groundwork for what was to become in this world. But the work that they were doing was important. The use of synthetic cannabinoids, such as those synthesized by Huffman and his colleagues, have vastly increased scientific knowledge on the characteristics of the interaction between cannabinoids and their receptors.
Well, this is obviously, it's quite a dilapidated building, so you wouldn't normally associate a modern chemistry laboratory with this. And the equipment that they're using is quite dirty, covered in filth, and so any contaminants present that they haven't cleaned out from a previous reaction ends up in the new reaction, and you don't know what the toxicity of that potential new compound they make could be.
This one here, you're able to send quite a lot of this into the UK. This one?
Yeah, no problem.
One of the popular ways that synthetic cannabinoids are used is they are impregnated into smokable herbs. To the untrained eye, this might look somewhat like cannabis, but it's not even close. Once these drugs have been synthesized, often in bulk in labs in China, then it gets dissolved in a solvent, often acetone. The synthetic acetone cannabinoid solution is poured over or sprayed on a mixture of these smokable herbs like damiana leaf or marshmallow leaf or dried mugwort. The acetone is then evaporated, leaving a herbal mixture that somewhat resembles weed, but the effects of smoking it would be nothing like weed. It would in fact be completely unpredictable. Unlike weed, you can overdose on the synthetic cannabinoid impregnated herbal mix that's often stuffed into foil envelopes and sold. It can also be sold as a vape mix or as a pure chemical, or less often in pill form. And in prisons, it's very often impregnated into paper or clothes to get it in easily.
And one of the most horrifying and remarkable and unexpected effects of these new forms of spice, it switches off their consciousness completely. And so they actually don't know who they are, they don't know where they are. Sometimes they can't even stand, other times they go stiff. We call it catatonia. And in a sense, their body gets so overwhelmed that it can't work, and they either collapse or they get locked into this situation. So we think it's probably something to do with the dopamine system in the brain. As you turn on dopamine more and more, eventually you get to a state where there's too much dopamine, and you're either manic or you're paranoid, because dopamine drives paranoid thinking. All they seem to do is disrupt brain function extraordinarily. That the impact on the brain is so powerful that people don't remember what's happened.
This has become a multi-billion-dollar industry in China. The markup on synthetic cannabinoids is staggering. The amount of chemical in a gram of spice that might go between £5 and £10 in the UK costs a small fraction of $1 to make in China, if not a fraction of a penny. Of course, once it gets into prisons, that price goes up exponentially, but we'll get onto that in a minute. In these years, in sort of the first half of the noughties, synthetic cannabinoids were perfectly legal in the UK. And back then, they weren't just associated with these distinct social groups that we were talking about before, like they are now, the prison population, the homeless population, and sort of school kids. Back then, they had more mainstream appeal. The story of how they got onto the drug scene back then in the UK is the story of a company called the 𝙧𝙪𝙧𝙪𝙜. But before I get into that, let's have a quick word from our sponsor. This video is brought to you by Easy Test Kits, quick, reliable and affordable testing kits for all your favourite party prescriptions. These are presumptive testing kits, meaning they can give you a very good indication as to what is in your baggie. To learn more or to pick up, say, a synthetic cannabinoid testing kit, click on the link in the description and use my promo code 𝙭 for a 10% discount. The story of the company called the 𝙧𝙪𝙧𝙪𝙜 is an intriguing one in and of itself. The synthetic cannabinoid craze was born at a time when people were being creative with British drug laws. In 2002, a London-based British student called Richard Watson reckoned he'd come up with a loophole that would allow magic mushrooms to be sold legally as long as they were fresh and not dried. But he wasn't about to start openly selling them unless he was sure. There were some obstacles in the way, he told the journalist Mark Wilding in 2017. Quote, "But I realised that this could be a big money spinner." So Watson wrote to the British Home Office and asked them if his loophole was legally sound. And to his astonishment, in March of 2002, he received a reply telling him that the sale of fresh magic mushrooms was, in fact, perfectly legal. It was one of those moments that doesn't seem quite real, Watson told Wilding. Before long, he began importing mushrooms from Amsterdam and started a company called the 𝙧𝙪𝙧𝙪𝙘, supplying head shops around the UK with fresh magic mushrooms. Whenever one of his staff members were moving the product around on motorways, they would carry photocopies of the Home Office's letter in case they got stopped by the police. The 𝙧𝙪𝙧𝙪 was soon selling kilos and kilos of mushies perfectly legally. In 2003, the Guardian newspaper did a front page splash saying that the company was selling 5,000 doses of mushrooms a week. They said this was happening through 3 market stalls in London and 30 head shops across the country. That wasn't ideal, as it alerted the situation to the government, who, on the 18th of July 2005, eventually banned the sale of mushrooms in any form.
The police have put on extra patrols in the Savernake Forest in Wiltshire to discourage people from picking magic mushrooms. Officers say the small plants are now a Class A drug, ranking them alongside heroin and crack cocaine. They've already made 6 arrests. Scott Ellis joined the police on patrol.
Not an obvious spot for police patrols, but at this time of year, the ancient Savernake Forest is in some respects a drugs den. This is a magic mushroom, also known as a Liberty cap.
Just a tiny nipple on the top there, and then underneath it's just slightly brown.
Within the plant is psilocybin, which when ingested has a psychedelic effect. The plant, even when picked fresh, is now a Class A drug.
I'm technically in possession of a Class A drug, however, my intention will be to destroy it, so I would have to bag it up and then ask for a destruction order on it.
So you can't just throw that down on the forest floor?
No, unfortunately, because I've taken it in my possession now, I would have to destroy it.
The police have cautioned several people in recent weeks, most of them unaware that freshly picked magic mushrooms are Class A. The change came in 2005 to prevent shops picking and selling the fresh mushrooms. These are the very last legal plants being sold that year at Glastonbury and at the Ashton Court Festival.
I've sold mushrooms Saturday and Sunday at this festival, and yet tomorrow, if I had any stock and a policeman came along and saw that stock, I could be arrested and sent to jail.
Police say they'll arrest anyone picking magic mushrooms.
The journalist who wrote that article for The Guardian in 2003, a guy called 𝘿𝙧𝙪𝙜𝙪𝙪𝙜𝙪, he actually wrote a blog last year saying that he massively regrets writing the article because he didn't realise that there was so many medicinal benefits from mushrooms, and a lot of people didn't get the benefits because it got banned, and it got banned as a result of his article. He wrote, "In a lengthy career as a journalist, there are many stories I wish I'd never written, but my biggest regret by far is an article I wrote about magic mushrooms more than 20 years ago." The only reason that that loophole worked in the first place was because of how the law had been written. Psilocybin, magic mushrooms, was banned under the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act, but it was only if the mushrooms had been dried or, quote, altered by the hand of man that they constituted a Class A drug. As the law stood at the time until they changed it in 2005, the gathering or possession of fresh mushrooms had never been an offence in the first place. The day the ban came into force, the 𝙧𝙪𝙧𝙪𝙧 announced their retirement in the mushroom game. Their website went dark apart from a message that read, "This was the 𝙧𝙪𝙧𝙪 LLP, but now it's all over and we've shut. We've got to find something to do with ourselves. We're working to bring you the next legal big thing." And in January 2006, that big thing came along. The 𝙧𝙪𝙧𝙪's website was updated once again. It said, "The 𝙧𝙪𝙧𝙪 remains committed to sourcing new and effective ethernogenic products. We are proud to introduce Spice, an impressive new herbal blend. They are not simply substitutes, they act on the same brain sites as herbal cannabis. Some of these new compounds are about 30, even up to 500 times more potent." Just like that, the 𝙧𝙪𝙧𝙪 was back up in business with a new legal drug, but this time it was not small plastic boxes of the natural drug psilocybin in magic mushrooms. It was small foil packets labelled "not for human consumption," containing synthetic cannabis loaded herbal mixtures.
Well, this is Spice, and it's being sold at just about every shop along here. According to the packet, it's an exotic incense blend that's not for human consumption. But when they were recommending which one was strongest, I don't think they were talking about the smell.
In April of 2007, the company trademarked the Spice logo, initially describing the product as incense. The Spice brand name, which ended up becoming a catch-all term eventually for all synthetic cannabinoids, and logo appear to have been inspired by melange, a fictional drug which featured in the Dune series of science fiction novels by Frank Herbert.
The spice melange. On the planet of Arrakis exists a substance so valuable, so rare, and so necessary to our way of life that countless people have toiled, bled, and even died to harvest this natural resource.
In these novels, the fictional drug is referred to as, quote, the spice, and caused the eyes of the users to turn blue. Herbert himself is believed to have taken his inspiration for writing Dune from his own experimentations with magic mushrooms. In 2009, spice was a number of the legal highs banned in the UK. The psychedelic shut down its operations several months before, sold its stock to a Dutch head shop, and sold the intellectual property of the brand Spice to a different Dutch company. As the supply of the original Spice dwindled, new companies with new brands, K2, Black Mamba, etc. popped up. Some contained the same synthetic cannabinoids that Spice did, others contained much more potent ones. A second generation of synthetic cannabinoids, which were much stronger than the first, were banned in the UK in 2013. But every time the ban comes in, producers just create new, different ones. According to the European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction, synthetic cannabinoids were widely available in the UK since the early years of the new millennium. They were marketed as legal and safer weed alternatives. They were sold in bright packaging under various trade names, Spice being the most popular of all time. The different vendors sold the products as either fine perfumes, incense, plant refreshing agents, and so on. They started eventually not just being sold in head shops, they would also be sold in petrol stations, news agencies, off licenses, and online. The labels always read not for human consumption or for research purposes only. The herbal ingredients of the products were listed without any mention of its synthetic cannabinoid content. Professor Huffman in 2009 was asked how he felt about his research going on to influence a drug trend. In a 2009 interview with the Financial Times, he said, quote, "We had no idea that anyone would be stupid enough to use it. If you want to get high, marijuana is easily available." Those words haven't really aged very well, but they do seem to slightly contradict an interview which he made to the trade magazine Chemical and Engineering News in 2010. Quote, "I wasn't the least bit surprised," he said, talking of when he learnt that JWH-018 was being sold for recreational use. Quote, "Somebody is going to look for something to make money from and to bring people temporary pleasure," he said. He suspects that the underground chemists used his published data as a basis for synthesizing JWH-018, which then went into the Spice brand. "You put two and two together," he said. Other compounds that Huffman and his colleagues created, such as JWH-073, have also been discovered in herbal blends. He is concerned, though, about the unknown effects on humans. "Using these things is like playing Russian roulette," he said, "because we just don't have the toxicity data." Ultimately, Huffman does not feel remorse about creating the compound because his intentions were pure. Quote, "You cannot be responsible for what other people do," he says. "We made this as a research compound and published it, and we did what we were supposed to do." One place where synthetic cannabinoids, or spice if you're going to use the catch-all term, has wreaked havoc is in British prisons, where they're associated with overdose, medical emergencies, mental health emergencies, and bullying. Synthetic cannabinoids got massive in British prisons in the late noughties and the early 2010s. It's a perfect drug there. It's a strong drug that can easily be smuggled in, for instance, soaked onto letters and passed over by visitors. On top of that, It's ideal for dodging compulsory drug testing in prison because most tests can't detect it, and smoking it doesn't stink like weed, so it's easier to get away with using it. It's also a drug that's very good at killing time. A year can feel like a month if you're caning a drug that knocks you out cold half the time.
For some reason, no one really understands where this came from. It was never discussed with the prison governors, but they decided to start testing for drugs in prison. I suspect there was a minister that was probably looking for a job in a testing company when he got sacked. I don't know, just a suspicion. And the decision was made, let's start testing prisoners. Now, you smoke a spliff, you can be the cannabis will be detected for a month. So what did they do? The first thing the prisoners did, they switched to heroin. And then they tried to switch to pregabalin, the prescription drug. But then it became harder to get those. So then someone had a clever idea. Well, why don't you smoke spice? But what's worse is that the first synthetic cannabinoids actually had been made and tested in humans back in the 1970s. But they were never marketed. They were made to be super cannabis medicines for things like nausea, and they weren't marketed because they were so horrible. When they gave them to people to test, everyone hated them. And then the government decided, well, we're going to ban these first generation so-called synthetic cannabinoids. And then the second generation came along, but the second generation had never been tested in humans. They'd just been tested in rats. So the government banned those. And then the third generation have just been invented based on chemical structure. So the first exposure of these new compounds to any life form are in prisoners. It's just absolutely ridiculous. And it's all because we're obsessed with stopping prisoners smoking cannabis. In the Netherlands, they don't care. They don't test prisoners. Well, if a prisoner's stoned, it's much easier to,
According to this 2023 study, participants reported that the most common way of getting spice in prison was when it was infused in paper, and the most common route of administering it was via e-cigarettes. Here's an example of the process that's used to vape one of those pieces of paper that's been impregnated with synthetic cannabinoids. Prisoners pay for synthetic cannabinoids in different ways. They might get a friend on the outside to make a bank transfer, or they might swap things in their canteen, or they might trade anything else that's lying around. Participants in the same study described a range of pricing options that were available for different amounts of infused paper. A single hit, 1 to 2 centimetres square, could cost £2.50, or an ID card size of the sheet, referring to the ID card that prisoners are issued when they enter prison, which approximately 5 8 centimetre squared pieces costs £50.
I was in Belmarsh prison recently, and I was they've got a massive issue, as all prisons have across the United Kingdom now, with spice. So I inhaled what was the residue of a vape while I was there, given to me by a prison officer on camera. I can actually feel that.
No, I know.
And I can feel it.
Money, isn't
it? You barely touched it though, did you? You barely even took
No, I went like that, and literally I can feel that. Yeah, just like a bit. There you go, couldn't actually speak there. And I can only describe, as I'm not often lost for words, but I was at that moment.
Spice normally will either go one way or the other. They'll either be really aggressive or they'll be unconscious.
In December 2009, as I mentioned, the synthetic cannabinoids that constituted spice were banned in the UK. They were classified as a Class B drug under the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971. While some producers, like the Psychedelic, simply stopped trading, others stayed several steps ahead of the regulators by tweaking the chemical structure of these substances to circumvent legal restrictions. The trade shifted away from head shops or legit online retailers to street-level sales and sales on the dark web. These new second-generation synthetic cannabinoids were much more potent and much more dangerous than their predecessor. General use of synthetic cannabinoids then declined in mainstream sesh culture as the government started to ban them. A second piece of legislation was brought in 2013 to ban the second generation synthetic cannabinoids. It's been so many generations that there is now hundreds of different types of synthetic cannabinoids in the system. There was only 3 societal subsets that continued using it generally, and that was, as I've mentioned, the homeless community, school kids who often can't get better drugs or can't afford to pay the proper price for a THC vape pen, and of course people in prison. Proper THC vapes are quite expensive. If someone's buying what they're being told is a THC vape and it only costs between £5 and £10, that is probably not a cannabis product. As more and more synthetic cannabinoids have hit the market, they've become more toxic, more dangerous and more addictive. The drugs have become further and further removed from the original products. The attempts to ban the synthetic cannabinoids by controlling the first and second wave of them failed because compounds with novel structures can be produced quickly. There was already new synthetic cannabinoids ready to come onto the market, made in anticipation for the ban. So when the ban came in, the next generation just came through. Now we end up with these sort of Frankenstein substances that are the latest generation of synthetic cannabinoids, and they don't really bear any resemblance to the first generation of synthetic cannabinoids that many people sort of described having an effect that is rather mild, like cannabis. In 2019, there was a report suggesting that 95% of the homeless population in Manchester used spice.
We were told legal cannabinoid. It wasn't as strong back then, but then all of a sudden, because we was bringing it in from Rotterdam, this started it just got stronger and stronger, and now they're making it in kitchens in fucking Manchester, Liverpool, fucking all over the place.
It's killing people.
It's killing people. It literally is killing people. A kid was found, right? I was on Oxford Road the other week, yeah, and this fella, he sat against the bin, and I just thought he was sparked out. Man was dead.
The war on drugs created synthetic cannabinoids, and they also made them morph into more dangerous substances as time went on. Are you starting to see a familiar pattern on this channel? Attempts to make a drug safer by prohibiting that drug are invariably counterproductive, exasperating the problems. We've seen this again and again and again. Cracking down on weed created the contaminated gritweed saga of 2006, 2007. Cracking down on MDMA created the rise in synthetic caffeinoids. We've even seen synthetic opioids due to the Taliban cracking down on poppy farming in Afghanistan. So why are synthetic cannabinoids much more dangerous than weed? Natural cannabis has a relatively low risk profile, whereas synthetic cannabinoids can be far more potent and unpredictably toxic. According to this study from King's College London, the fact that synthetic cannabinoids are much more toxic than cannabis, despite the fact that they both work on the same cannabinoid receptors, is down to 3 features. Number 1, synthetic cannabinoids show a 50 to 300 times greater affinity for the CB1 receptor than THC, so a smaller amount occupies most receptors. Number 2, they are full agonists at CB1 receptors, whereas THC is a partial agonist, so they stimulate the receptor more. And number 3, synthetic cannabinoids are also full agonists at the CB2 receptor, with downstream effects on other receptors, including the 5-HT2A receptor implicated in seizures. So a big issue here is the unpredictability of the effects. You know, if you go and buy cannabis flower, you pretty much know what you're going to get. You can predict accurately, you can smell the cannabis, look at the cannabis, make a general assumption of its quality, and you know what you're going to get. But with synthetic cannabinoids, you could be getting any substance. It could be double the strength of your average spliff, or it could be 200 times the strength of your average spliff. It's like going into the pub and being given a nondescript liquid where they won't tell you if it's beer or whiskey. You know, that's one of the big risks of synthetic cannabinoids. On top of their utterly unpredictable potency, synthetic cannabinoids are known for their higher addiction potential, increased toxicity, which in extreme cases can raise the risk of heart attacks and respiratory failure, and vicious withdrawal effects. On top of that, seizures. It really can be a nasty drug if you get the wrong synthetic cannabinoid. And prisoners are taking this because they're not allowed weed? That just reminds me of the topsy-turvy pretzel logic that underpins the war on drugs. Synthetic cannabinoids can destroy someone's mental and physical health. They seem to take root in communities of vulnerable people, like those on the street, living on the fringes of society, or desperate people in prison for whom merely existing right now can feel like a struggle. For many of those people, these drugs provide an instant, albeit dangerous, form of relief, a swift dose of escapism. These substances have the ability to make today's problems belong to tomorrow, but this is, of course, just a temporary reprieve. Tomorrow rolls by and the problems still persist, just as tumultuous and chaotic and distressing, perhaps even worse. That is some people's reality today. Can we blame them for wanting to escape? The fact that some children unwittingly take these same drugs at school when they think they are getting weed is shocking to me. I worry the kids don't know what they're getting themselves in for. After vaping weed, you'd expect a somewhat gentle experience, getting a bit too involved in a nature documentary before eating a bowl of cereal at an inappropriate time in the evening perhaps. Not unwittingly galloping through enough synthetic cannabinoids to totally disentangle you from reality. That's not good. But overall, I'd like to see more empathy towards people who use synthetic cannabinoids. The press call the users zombies, but zombies are fictional characters, and these are just people who are severely down on their luck. Even the journalists who write those headlines, their drug of choice is coke, by the way, which carries much less stigma. If they were down on their luck, sleeping under a railway arch dripping with rain tonight, maybe they'd want to escape too. After all, this could happen to anyone. We're all just 4 walls away from the street.